Good evening. My name is Krista Akampora, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for the fourth and final event in a series that we've titled The Experience of War, Moral Transformation, Injury, and Repair, which is sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities, to whom we are deeply, deeply grateful for the support. This is part of an umbrella of programs that explore war and its aftermath, promote discussion of the experience of military service, and support returning veterans and their families. And for those of you who haven't been attending the other programs, the structure of Hunter's program is to have a theme each month. And then typically we have small group discussions of a key source in the humanities that's been selected as part of the program that we discuss alongside typically a modern either interpreter or someone who speaks to the theme of the program. And that is usually followed by a capstone public event. But for May, we are doing things in the reverse. So we have our capstone event tonight, and then you still have the opportunity to sign up for a small group discussion about works by our presenters tonight, as well as Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals. No reading is necessary in advance, so don't be nervous. Don't let that intimidate you. And if you sign up for a small group discussion tonight, we will email to you the articles, and we will give you a copy of Nietzsche's genealogy to bring along with you if you come to one of our public events. So small group discussion. So we hope that we will see you there, and you can sign up upstairs at the reception afterwards. Since tonight is our last public event, I do have some people I really need to thank. Gina Sissoko is my program coordinator extraordinaire, and she's done excellent work on the project. If you have been involved in any way, you have surely interacted with Gina. Rafael Munoz is her counterpart here at Roosevelt House. He has done extraordinary things keeping us organized and making us comfortable while we're here. Daniel Culkin is our AV technician and other communication guru, so thank you very much for your work. The student workers at our events who've helped you register and set up the reception. Our discussion leaders, a very distinguished group who I introduced to you the first night, who are working with students in classes here and at SUNY Oswego, as well as at various sites at Hunter and in the larger community. And I also want to thank the director of Roosevelt House, Harold Holzer, and Hunter's president, Jennifer Rabb, for their support. And I also want to thank you, because I've seen some of you 4 times now, as well as at some of our small group discussions. So thank you very much for your participation. The theme for May is moral transformation and war. And I thought I would open just by ruminating for just a minute about why we picked transformation. The terms moral injury and to a lesser extent, moral repair are commonly used in the clinical community to describe at least one kind or a family of kinds of moral experiences in war. And when we organized our series, we were interested very much in exploring this theme, but we also recognized that not everyone who experiences moral change in war is injured, and not everyone who finds moral change in war challenging necessarily sees themselves as standing in need of repair. So the term moral transformation might capture those experiences that may not fall under the other umbrellas. And so it was important for us to highlight that in our title, and it seems a particularly fitting way for us to end. So tonight we'll hear from an expert about current research in the clinical context, and we'll have an expert guide for thinking about the moral in moral transformation and how that is so important to our sense of ourselves. Joining our main presenters at the podium and in our discussion space after the formal presentations will be veteran writers who have participated in our programs and for whom the program themes resonate. These readers include Noah Dinesh, a Hunter student completing a course on the theme of the program. She will read a personal narrative by a veteran who wishes to remain anonymous. Owen Powell is a veteran with 25 years of service, now an artist and student who will share a dimension of his homecoming. And Mariette Kalinowski, featured in our last public event, a Marine veteran, Hunter graduate, and participant in our Discussion Leader program. And you'll find more about each of our readers in the insert in your programs for tonight. And now I am happy to introduce our main speakers. Brett Litz is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Boston University School of Medicine and the Psychology Department at Boston University, as well as the director of the Mental Health Core of the Massachusetts Veterans Epidemiological Research and Information Center at the VA Boston Healthcare System. He earned his PhD in clinical psychology from the State University of New York at Binghamton and did his clinical internship at the Palo Alto VA Medical Center. Dr. Litz is principal investigator on various research projects funded by the Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs and the NIMH. He is internationally recognized as an expert on military trauma and early intervention for trauma and traumatic loss. Dr. Litz's recent work entails evaluations of the psychiatric, psychological, social, and spiritual impact of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars among active duty military personnel and veterans, and conducting clinical trials of psychotherapy developed by Litz and his colleagues called adaptive disclosure that targets war zone trauma, loss, and moral injury. Jesse Prinz is a distinguished professor of philosophy and director of interdisciplinary science studies at the City University of New York Graduate Center. His research focuses on the perceptual, emotional, and cultural foundations of human psychology. He is author of over 1,000 articles. 1,000? Wow, Jesse. Way to go. He is author of over 100, but we'll be, next time we see you, maybe 1,000. And several books, including Furnishing the Mind, Gut Reactions, The Emotional Construction of Morals, Beyond Human Nature, and The Conscious Brain. Please join me in welcoming all of our presenters, and especially our first presenter, Noah Dinesh, reading Why is Home a Bus with Very Few Windows?
Hello, my name's Noah Dinesh. I'm going to be reading an account written by a dear friend of mine who was a veteran. He was a marksman in the IDF during Operation Protective Edge. He wishes to remain anonymous, but this is his account. Thermaling high before the snuggled eucalyptus groves, the agriculture makes me hungry. There is a metallic taste wherever the vegetation is sparse and the hillsides don't match. Survival, Evasion, and Escape is a book that was handed to me when I worked in a coffee shop when I was 16 years old. I wanted to know how to survive. The Israeli army must have planted over 1 million eucalyptus trees sometime after the 6-Day War. In northern Israel, eucalyptus trees are not natural and are used as a natural barrier to shield roads, which have become valuable in the landscape. What a sight that must have been, 1,000 trucks and thousands of soldiers carrying trees, digging holes, and the commanders giving orders to plant them. A sergeant once said to me, "War is a triangle. The bottom left is the self, across the way is the enemy, and up at the top is the mission." I had never understood. As I looked out the window hours into this journey, I note that every fifth tree nurses a companion sign, which reads, "Warning, landmines," in several languages. The red letters flash by. I touch my face to the glass, and it feels remarkable. Reflexively, my hand moves to my right eye. The bruise from the day before is now red hot and inflamed. Eye injuries had been an anxiety in my household growing up. On any given day, you would find tape on the backside of all of the hammers in the house as a makeshift form of risk stratification. "You don't want to hook out your eye," my mother would say. I take several moments to regain myself. Dust and sand fly around. The radio breaks through the silence. Tzetha l'shalom, veshuvha l'shalom. Come in peace, go in peace. Could I ever go from here in peace? I now have an effective range of 1,200 meters. Every time the ground shakes, I feel smaller. A bullet dropped from the hand or shot from the gun will hit the ground at the same time. Gravity pulls everything toward Earth at 9.8 meters per second squared. This is acceleration. The difference between speed and velocity is direction. I will have no direction. Does gravity ride everything? It rode the large truck while it approached a fork near a border checkpoint. The radio buzzed to life as the truck swerved past a barrier. Moments later, the scope smashed my eye socket. There was no protective tape. The burlap and twigs were not soft at speed. The car was on fire, and there was nobody at the wheel. We were all in the belly of this beast, and it was bleeding to death. When I was hurt, my mother would always have an herbal remedy prepared. "Melaleuca," she said twice while holding ice to my face. I cried and sobbed. It didn't really hurt, but my mother's affection came in waves. When it broke over my reef, I had to ride it. My knee scrapes never hurt until she picked me up to tell me it was okay. "Mommy's here," she would say. The anger is gone now. Melaleuca, the Latin name for the oil of the eucalyptus tree, reminds me of her. I wept for myself. There is one sign per 5 trees. Maybe we are going 60 miles an hour, and a sign every 6 seconds would mean. I stopped myself from doing the math. I don't want to know how many warning signs there are. In the mountains surrounding Israel, there is a climate that sustains snow, sometimes so much that the barbed-wire fences there are concealed. There is a sad story of a family who wandered off the road to play in the snow. The terror of the fully plastic explosive mine permeates me. To place one is considered a war crime, but they are virtually impossible to locate beneath the dirt. I became wiser from every teacher, and I still throw rocks near the barbed wire fences. I thought risk was something to be managed. In this place, I am an unknown quantity. I work, I adjust to a level of comfort. I eat well. I haven't slept lying down in 8 weeks. I dig more holes. Each time the shovel pierces the sand, I can hear my dad saying, "The tide is coming in, we'd better hurry," and his arms could always scoop up more than mine. I watch the sunset to let my eyes adjust to darkness. I note the distances of objects with old tools similar to those used to survey roads. The night comes in and my notebook is full of notes about which trees are at 466 meters. That's the sweet spot. When I sit at home in California, the map still reads like a knuckled fist shoved into a pocket. The thin paper is flimsy and made to dissolve in water. I think you can eat it, too. I should endeavor to eat it one day if the feeling of it stuck in my throat, the pain of swallowing something that is just too big, ever goes away. Thank you.
Thank you. And now for our presenter, Dr. Brett Litz.
Good evening. Good to be with all of you this evening. I was asked to give a 15-minute talk, and I want to tell you how totally impossible that is for me to try to put together. I usually talk a lot, and my lectures are usually at least an hour. So I really struggle with and not knowing who you all are. I'm sure there are clinicians and veterans and non-clinician academics and just interested folks or loved ones of veterans or what have you in the audience. To be honest, this issue of moral injury is very complex and fuzzy and confused, and it requires a lot of explanation. At least that's what I think to myself. So I would want to just give you a big survey, but I can't do that. So two possibilities exist in terms of my expectation that 15 minutes is not enough. One is that 15 minutes is not enough. I really need more time and space to really cover the material. The other is that I could just really kind of suck at condensing a lot of material, and I don't know which is true. We'd have to do an experiment to really figure that out. Maybe randomly assign half of you to like a mumbled mixture of the slides I'm going to present, and another half to of those. You would see the slides as I would present them to you today, and maybe it wouldn't matter what the order is. But I'll do my best, and I'll cover a lot of different topics. I'm self-conscious about this 15-minute thing, to be honest, because there's a lot of what I'm going to present to you there's a lot of non sequiturs, because there's a lot I would want to present to kind of substantiate these ideas. But I'll give it a go. So I have to provide a context for why I started to be interested in moral compromise, moral transgression, and its impact in the military and among war veterans. And really it boils down to this, which is a moral challenge for the DoD and the VA. That is, the therapies that work exceptionally well for uncomplicated, single-incident, adult onset traumas like motor vehicle accidents and sexual assaults, which are terrible, but the evidence for sexual assault among women with PTSD from sexual assault or motor vehicle accidents, these evidence-based therapies, these first-line therapies, they work exceptionally well in those contexts, but they work substantially less well for service members with complex presentations, complex traumas and histories and what have you. And the challenge for me in at least 25 of my 30-year career is really to ask this question, why is this the case and what can we do about it? And that really characterizes my work. And that's what really brought me to this idea of moral injury. But there are obstacles in the field that I want to share with you to kind of give you a context of what's going on in the clinical arena about this construct of moral injury, which I'll define in a few minutes. But there are challenges, and it's striking and frustrating that the idea of PTSD and trauma and its treatment, assessment, and what have you has been along for a long time. But we have a lot to learn, and there's a lot of unanswered questions. And there are problems in the field that in part drive my work. One is that we over-medicalize this idea of trauma and PTSD. PTSD is a kitchen sink syndrome. There are a lot of symptoms in there that are sort of appendages of prior ideas about trauma, and a lot of it is not science-based. And you could barely not have PTSD, let's say you miss it by a symptom and be suffering terribly, or you could have PTSD, this mental illness, and you're functioning just fine. So there's a real problem with the over-medicalization of trauma and PTSD. The other problem, which is related to it, is that at least in the clinical arena, there's really been a sort of monodisciplinary approach. And when I started my career, there used to be case conferences, and there would be a social worker and a chaplain talking about cases, and a nurse perhaps, and there would be ideas from all sorts of disciplines that would come to bear about a case, but that doesn't happen anymore, right? Currently, it's basically clinical psychology sort of dominates the field because psychotherapies work much better than medications, but it's all medical model. It's ostensibly psychiatry, and I have been edified and I've learned a great deal by just broadening what I read and who I expose myself to, who I have been around, especially being around service members and leaders in the military, but also chaplains and the clergy. And I've had a lot of different conversations with, journalists and philosophers and historians and people studying the law. It's really aroused a lot of interest for good reason. So I've been edified. I've learned a lot, and it has informed my work. But as a field, we're way too monodisciplinary. Another thing that dominates the clinical landscape is this expectation of what I call the equipotentiality of trauma. That if you have a motor vehicle accident and you're just scared shitless and nothing else happens, and you have PTSD as a result from that, that your outcome and what is prescribed for you as a treatment is the same as if you were drunk, you made a bad decision, you drove the car, someone was harmed, and it had nothing to do with fear. It has a lot to do with the moral choice of driving in that way and harming others. Or you could be driving and there's negligence in terms of the mechanics of an automobile, and you get into an accident. So there's this betrayal of the expectation that of industry standards and what have you. Those three different types of cases would be treated all the same in the field, and that's a huge problem. And the medical model is driven by this expectation that the defining characteristic of trauma is the being frightened and being personally victimized. That is the core of our understanding of the effects of trauma on human beings. It has driven the field. It dominates the field. Right now, there's a real biological fetish to try to find this biological solution to conditioned fear. And this is a real problem because, especially in the professional cultures, fear is life threat or personal threat is often an occupational hazard. There's plenty of opportunities to heal and repair from, let's say, some kind of hairy experience. And loss, traumatic loss, is a completely different phenomenology. It requires a different kind of way of thinking. It's not fear-based. It's not personal victimization-based per se. And moral injury requires a different kind of thinking. And the other thing that, how many clinicians are in the audience? Okay, so just a couple, yeah. So this may not see the 15 minutes. So there's a lot to explain about some of the problems with the field in terms of the therapies. If you sought therapy for PTSD in, let's say, at a university center, you're going to get, regardless of your presentation, you're probably going to get these two therapies that are out there as the first-line therapies: prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. And these have been disseminated. These were disseminated in the VA, and a lot of money was spent on dissemination without sufficient evidence that they work with war veterans and service members. Okay? Talk about a moral issue. But they were sold, the evidence that sold them was the fact that they work well with women with sexual assault. And this was a big driver of my desire to get away from the fear and victimization model. Really, it was the hubris of the disseminators of these first-line therapies saying, we've got it covered, we're going to take care of our service members and our veterans, and as it turns out, it's not happening. Okay, so more to the point, this is perhaps the first non sequitur. So I've been motivated to bring science to bear about this issue of moral injury, and it is clinical science. I have to admit to my bias. I'm in the repair game. You can't repair people unless you can define in an operational way what is wrong with them, and you can't research something unless you can define it. So we wrote a paper that is pretty widely referenced because it's sort of like the only sciencey paper about moral injury, and in it we tried to define what moral injury is, and this was our assumption is that there are experiences that cause crises of conscience that are harming. So if you have a crisis of your conscience, that can harm you, and the outcome is experienced multi-dimensionally, psychologically, biologically, socially, and spiritually. And the thing that harms you is this latter part of this sentence, which is that it's perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So this is a guiding definition for us, but if you look carefully, it doesn't actually define the outcome. And that's kind of, I guess my job in part was to tell you about the state of the science, and I'll get to this in a moment with another slide, but the state of the science is that we don't have consensus about what this outcome is. And we're working furiously to try to answer that. And that's a problem in the field generally, is that there is not a consensus, and there certainly isn't sufficient scientific justification for the terms that you all use when you say moral injury, or use it in your whatever context. Because there's so many, I hear so many different things, it's really pretty extraordinary. And that can't just be a problem for the clinical sciences or clinical care. It's got to be a problem for the social sciences or philosophy or whatever, English literature, you name it. Okay, so so it's important, at least in my work, and I sort of preach this, it's important to disaggregate events from outcomes. So events there's nothing inherently morally injurious about an event. You could well argue that there are events that all of us would be injured by, but there's just so much variation in how events are impacted on an individual. There's so many contextual and cultural variables. The example of killing is the best one, because most of us in here would be traumatized by an act of killing, but think about the war context where if it's within the rules of engagement, it is your job, and we might think, well, service members should be alarmed by that and they should be harmed by that. And there's a lot, you'll read about this it's sort of politicized that killing must be harmful, but that's not an accurate read. Killing is potentially morally injurious. And here are the types of things that are potentially morally injurious. There are the kinds of things that you would all, I guess, think about. The one that I would underscore is this idea of mistakes and accidents. There are things that happen in the war zone because these are human beings, taxed, stressed, or just plain human, and mistakes are made. Someone may fall asleep on their watch and something bad happens. There is friendly fire. Think about that. Think about how to try to survive friendly fire, being the agent of that. So those are I should say that in the domain of potentially morally injurious experiences, there are things that one does or fails to do that are personal to the person. And then there's the experience of the individual in terms of what others do. And the other behaviors are really the kinds of things that Jonathan Shea first talked about when he coined the term moral injury, and he focused really on leadership failures and how corrosive that is and what have you. And so that's really what the other part is, that you could be, let's say, we'll use the term traumatized by a betrayal of a leader who makes a capricious decision or just makes a mistake, but it's their responsibility, and something catastrophic happens. How do you get your head around that? How do you have confidence in the military culture and your role in it if that happens? But there are a variety of things that are not necessarily traumatizing that certainly could color experience in the moral sense, and I'll share a continuum in another slide that tries to draw a distinction between traumatic events and, let's say, stressful events. But if you feel like the military didn't uphold their contract with you, and you had extended duty or multiple deployments, and you didn't think that would happen, or if you were an augmentee and you had to go into some unit and it wasn't what you're trained to do, and all of a sudden you're in a unit and it wasn't yours. These are things that are sources of betrayal that could color experience and could be harming. Okay, so events and outcomes differ. So there are potentially morally injurious events. And the state of the science is that we have developed a measure of exposure to potentially morally injurious military events, self and other. And we've developed a way of typing what are known as Criterion A events, traumatic events that service members and veterans report when they're evaluated for PTSD. You have to report a single event that is the insult. That's the nature of the medical model of PTSD. So you have to report this insult. And it usually has to have a life threat kind of flavor to it, or a victimization kind of flavor to it. That's the way the questions are shaped. But we did a study of about 1,000 service members seeking treatment for PTSD at Fort Hood. These were soldiers. About 80% of them had PTSD. All of them had these Criterion A events. So they could report something that was a traumatic event. And we developed this typing procedure, and these events are typable along the lines of whether it's a threat to self, threat to other, whether it's a moral injury self or other, or a traumatic loss. And we've developed, so it's a neat kind of, it has pushed the needle to be able to type these events. And what we've determined is that actually if you combine the non-light threat danger-based events, traumatic events, and compare it to the I forget what I said, whatever. So if you combine the non-danger events relative to the threat events, there are more non-danger events that lead people to seek treatment for PTSD. Okay, so that's kind of a moral unto itself, that service members are seeking treatment for PTSD, and it's not because they got scared shitless. That's not what brings them to therapy. And then in terms of the outcomes, this is where we're at, and this is the focus of my work. We're trying to figure it out. I've certainly had ideas for a very long time, probably starting around 2003, I have a colleague and collaborator who's a former captain in the Navy called, his name is Bill Nash, and we've had conversations, and I have other colleagues. We have a tight group of people who think about this quite often. So we have ideas, but the reality is that there isn't consensus, and we need to figure out what the outcome is. What is moral injury as an outcome? At the end of the day, it's going to be some combination of what are known as positive symptoms and negative symptoms. The positive symptoms are ostensibly PTSD-like, because PTSD is a disorder of being haunted. So you're going to be haunted by life events that are profoundly impactful. If you do some sort of extra-legal killing, and you could well imagine if someone's not a psychopath, they're going to be haunted by that. And PTSD is a disorder that is really the central driver is being haunted and consumed by something that happened. So, and then there are negative symptoms of, we're hardwired to maintain our standing in our relationships, and we're hardwired to survive as in groups. And to do that, we're also hardwired to follow the rules of groups, and if those are transcended, there are literally things that are predictably happen to human beings. Shame is associated with some predictable things that happen. In effect, human beings are not unlike dogs who have their tail between their legs, and they go off. There's research, a good body of research that shows there's some predictable downstream things that happen when people feel ashamed. And those are the kinds of things that we'd expect if it was a self-related injury. But if it's an other-related injury, the expectation is that a person would be angry and bitter and disappointed and sour. I'll tell you, clinicians mostly resonate with this idea of betrayal-based moral injury because they see it every day in the VA. That even if someone comes in and their principal trauma, their Criterion A event is a life threat experience, they are less likely to engage in therapy, they're more likely to kind of play games, less likely to trust their therapist, and less likely to get better because they're pissed off and they feel like they got a raw deal, and the transition from active duty to veteran status is always something that's very difficult to navigate. And there are many who feel betrayed by the military culture. They wanted to stay in it, and they may have been med-boarded out, and it's sort of like for reasons that they would not agree with per se. And so, but think about going into the military after 9/11. You have these expectations that you're going to really proudly serve your country. And the military, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the military, but it is an extraordinary organizational structure. And I've been so impressed. I've never had a good leader in the VA or at Boston University, to be honest. Nobody gets trained to be a leader. But in the military, there are really good leaders, and there's really good training and preparation. In the modern military, it's really impressive. And a lot of young men and women go in, and they want a career. And leaving that, it's a betrayal, not necessarily a traumatic kind of thing, but it colors their experience. Okay. So this is super important, and I'll walk you through this. So it's the challenge for the field is to create boundaries when there are really super fuzzy boundaries. And moral injury really, in my opinion, gets overused as a and I think you alluded to this, as a clinical syndrome. And I think we have to distinguish moral challenges, moral stressors, and potentially morally injurious experiences or moral injuries. And challenges lead to frustration, and they're universal. It's part of the human condition. I'm challenged every day by profound moral issues that are going on in the world right now. Chief among them, the lack of attention to climate change, the refugee problem in the world, the assault on the truth and science. I mean, these are moral issues that bother me every day, but I don't lose sleep over it. I don't not sit at the dinner table. I can still hang out with my wife. I can talk to my kid when she'll talk to me if she's in college, but and so that's part of the human condition. So those things are gonna be affecting someone every day. They're very, very frequent. It's part of the human condition if you have a conscience. And the outcome from that is not, you're not impaired, you're not suffering. You don't suffer from that. I take a hit. Trump hits me every day, but it doesn't really, it energizes me. I went to the science march thing in Boston. So that's certainly not pathology, but it's an issue. And then there are moral stressors which could lead to distress, and these are more acute things, less frequent. They're hard to ignore, and like a moral stressor for me was I had a colleague that stole my intellectual property. It was a huge deal, and it was a moral outrage, and because it's just not cool to steal someone's intellectual property. And she got this grant funded based on my writing, and that consumed me. And that changed my identity. That really altered me. That was an unavoidable and powerful, cause of changes in me. I'm a changed person from that experience. I have forgiven her, and I'm kind of over it. But in the acute stages of it, I was not in a good place. It was a very, very bad experience. So I would call that a moral stressor. Maybe because no one died. It's a pride issue, kinda. Then there are injuries.
Excuse me, I seriously have to ask a question here. Are you standing here in front of combat veterans suggesting to us that your experience of having moral intellectual property stolen from you is somehow in any way relevant to the veterans that you're talking about? Are you kidding me?
I don't understand.
This is incredibly offensive.
I'm sorry that you're offended by that.
How is this offensive? He's sharing his own experience.
No.
There's nothing offensive about what he's saying.
Equating this?
Oh.
He never equated it. He never equated it.
Excuse me.
He never equated it.
Excuse me. I think I can answer that question, but are you willing to hear the answer to it?
Yes, absolutely.
I'm not saying, I think that there are moral stressors in the military and you have to distinguish those from injuries, which I'm trying to do if you let me get to the injury part.
I wish you would.
Well,
Has it been
sure.
15 minutes yet?
I don't know.
I understand. Trust me, ma'am. I understand the
Yeah.
complexity of the issue.
I actually don't understand why you're getting so mad about this.
Because if you had lived through combat experiences, if you had seen dead civilians, dead service members, dismembered bodies, suffered V-bed attacks, suffered
Yes.
mortar attacks over 15 months,
Right.
or for years,
Sure.
you would be morally offended by this.
Hey, I have, and I'm not morally offended.
Yeah.
I have.
So-
I lived exactly what you just said. I lived exactly what you just said, and I am not morally offended.
It's cool.
He is only given his experience. He never equated it. As combatants, as veterans, we can't expect everyone to understand what we went through. So he's just given his experience. Bear with them.
Yeah, I appreciate
Okay, I
that.
have to say, because
Everything you just said, I experienced. Everything you just said, I experienced. Personally, I experienced. I'm a veteran. I'm a combat veteran.
I'm losing time here. I appreciate that. Yeah.
He's only trying. He's not equating. He's
I
just trying
appreciate-
to relate to us and on his own level. Bear with them. We're all human beings. We all love each other. Come on.
okay.
Yeah, and I appreciate your reaction.
I love you.
Thank you. Yeah. Right. But the point here is that there are events that happen to human beings in all sorts of contexts, in addition to the military, in addition to the hairy things that you're talking about. And we as a field, and certainly as clinicians, we need to distinguish those that are moral challenges, like being, let's say, not getting the right discharge, or having a conflict with some master sergeant who doesn't treat you well. They're supposed to treat you well. You're supposed to, have a good relationship. Those are sources of frustration. Then there are moral stressors. You could be overseas and hear about some conflict in your family, or a betrayal by a girlfriend or a boyfriend, etc., or some accident that happens to a child. Those are stressors that cause distress. And then there are injuries. And the injuries are these catastrophic, low-frequency things, if you take an epidemiological standpoint in terms of the entire military. These are not daily things, and epidemiologically, it's not. You mentioned like 20 things, man, and that's not typical, but that's awful. And an injury is a completely different thing, and that's the point I'm trying to make. That once you get to the point where it's injurious, then you can't sleep, and you are profoundly affected, and you are changed forever, and your identity has changed. And so the continuum here is that if you look at the bottom, and I urge you to look at the bottom, degree of mental, behavioral, social, and spiritual harm and impairment, this yellow stuff, cake, middle stuff, distress, not cake, can keep you up at night. And then moral injury can cause considerable and extreme mental and psychic and spiritual harm. That's the point. If you let me do that, I think you wouldn't have had that reaction, to be honest. If you let me say that. But maybe next time I'll present this slide and I'll say that first. Okay. So the last slide, because I'm sure I'm over time. How long has it been? Oh, geez. All right. Well, I could skip the repair stuff? Yeah. So this is all, coffee talk and intellectual banter unless we talk about repairing these injuries. And that's what I devote most of my career to, developing therapies and trying different approaches to help repair these wounds. And where the medical model doesn't work very well the medical model is there's an expectation that you have your disorder, you get your prescription, and then you're cured. In our work, we don't have the expectation of cure. We have the expectation of planting healing seeds. And the real change happens in a person's life. But in our work, regardless of, and this is a tough one, because regardless of the action, and this is a challenge to the morality of clinicians and citizens, that if someone is seeking help, that means that they deserve help, and that their pain means that there's hope, and actually their anguish and their shame or their anger is a sign that they have an intact conscience. And that's a powerful thing. That's the starter for therapy. Because if they didn't have an intact conscience, they wouldn't have been so affected by what happened. So forgiveness and repair is the assumption also is that regardless of who you're seeing, regardless of what they're reporting, some of which will raise the hair on the back of your neck, like the things that you pointed out, sir, that forgiveness and repair is possible. And that has to be our governing assumption. And the roots to moral repair, we have this therapy called adaptive disclosure. You could read about it. There's a book. But the core of it is that the psychotherapy part is only starting a process that really needs to happen over time, and that real repair requires doing things in one's world that are repairing. And the goal is to rebalance what is totally imbalanced. So if someone feels their identity is built around this idea that they are bad, then how do you repair that? You have to do things that balance those scales. And there are things you could do. There are things that society can do, and loved ones, and clinicians, and what have you. But ultimately, it's the service member or the veteran that has to do some things that are very challenging to repair maybe the harm that they've done or the harm done to them. Okay, so I know I talk too much. After all.
Thank you very much for that. And our next speaker is Owen Powell, who will be reading his Aloysius.
And now for something completely different. We're here for dialogue, right? Aloysius. It was February 2013, Valentine's Day. I went to a local toy store, one of those vast, sterile, fluorescent light-blasted affairs full of neon paint and frozen happiness. I wanted to buy my fiancé a stuffed animal, a dog, since we're not allowed to have pets in our apartment building. Somewhere to the back of the store, I came across an entire wall of stuffed animals. Squashed into rows of stainless steel racks, they regarded me with dull black eyes and stitched smiles, tongues lolling from their forced grins, except for one. In the middle of the stretched wall, right at waist height, was a single blue dinosaur. He was a brontosaurus, and whoever had made him had formed his face into the saddest expression possible. Not crying, with the tears of some stuffed clown, but just sad. Something about it resonated inside me. But he wasn't a dog, and so the search went on. I walked away, scanning the aisles for the elusive canine. Came back to the blue dinosaur. Walked away again. What kind of giant plastic toy depot doesn't have a huge menagerie of stuffed dogs on Valentine's Day? I mean, sure, there were a couple, but none were right. There's got to be one around here somewhere. Wandering through the store, looking for this damn dog, I somehow kept coming back to that sad brontosaurus. Stood there looking at him. Picked him up. He had a blue cloth hide, which was nice, firm, but soft. He had silly little stubby legs and a long curving tail. The thing that really got me, though, was that look on his face. Sad. Apprehensive. A little afraid. Why would he be afraid, I thought. And then it occurred to me. He was sad and afraid because his friends and family were dead. Think about it. He's a dinosaur. His friends and family died 65 million years ago, and he's been sitting here alone ever since. I was in a similar place at the time. My mother, father, and stepfather are not talking to me, still traumatized after the fist fight between my stepfather and I, and from the rippling echoes of jail, more arguments, and my subsequent homelessness.
Iraq was still heavy on my mind, full of death and horror, both of the Iraqis and my fellow soldiers. I put him back down. I walked away again. Kept an eye out for other blue dinosaurs in the store. Maybe he had someone there that could keep him company. No. Fuck, man, I can't just leave him here. I marched back, picked him up, tucked him under my arm. Maybe she would like a cute dinosaur instead of a dog. Right next to the cash register was a nice little toy dog with a pugnacious look on his face, so I grabbed him too. Maybe she would like 2 stuffed animals instead of just 1. Good thinking, right? So I took the 2 of them home, as well as some flowers and chocolates, and Valentine's Day was very nice. It quickly became apparent, though, that the blue brontosaurus was really for me. Now, I like stuffed animals as much as the next guy, but usually there's something that's simply something that has to be swept off the bed before having sex. This guy was different. Liz and I started to develop a funny ritual between us. Lying in bed, we would play with the stuffed animals, make up funny individual voices for them, animate them walking around us, talking, giving us hugs, kisses, and just talking about the day's events. The 2 favorites for this was Ted, an ancient and wise old bear who had literally been with her since she was 12 years old, and the Brontosaurus, who apparently needed a name. Because he was a small thing with that heartbreaking look of sadness and apprehension, I tried to think of the wimpiest, most pathetic name possible. Aloysius. Now, years ago, my dad had tried to get me to read Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. I hated it. Foppish British aristocracy bullshit, I thought. Quit reading about 10 pages in. Something about naming Aloysius, however, drove me to buy it and read it again, and so I discovered Sebastian, the eternal deluded child, and his stuffed toy bear, also named Aloysius. Reading the book, I realized that Aloysius was a personification of my inner child. Sure, on the outside, I was a massive retired soldier, Marine, tattooed combat vet, biker guy, but somewhere inside was something very different. Something that was very close to what the blue brontosaurus was. Sad, a little afraid, traumatized, and in need of someone who would comfort and love him, who would be gentle with him. So I would fall asleep holding the little blue dinosaur in the crook of my arm, and there was something about being loving and gentle with him that would directly reflect back inside of me. Regression? You bet, 100%. But it worked for both of us. Something about learning how to be gentle again in that childlike way with Aloysius was helping me to remember, to relearn how to be gentle with people. But wait, there's a post-traumatic stress wrinkle to this story. Fast forward just over a year, it's 22 February 2014, barely a month after my first big consciousness change. That day, according to some theories, was Ragnarok, the apocalypse, according to Nordic mythology. In commemoration of the day, I go off to my excellent local tattoo shop and get not 1 but 2 Nordic Valknuts tattooed on my chest. Very nice. Later, I would use the Valknut in the development of my own motorcycle colors. I am quite pleased with them. That night, Liz, now my wife, and I are at our favorite local bar, Snowdonia. Some guy that she knows says hi to her, and I think he's just a little bit too touchy-feely with her, right? I make the assumption, incorrectly as it turns out, that there's some past sexual connection between them that I don't know about. I don't say anything at the moment since I am just trying to start to be more mindful and peaceful, but it is all a thin veneer. And as soon as we get home, I go off on her, screaming, turns violent. Inside, I'm hurt, paranoid, angry about her past, oblivious to my own past, as men so conveniently are, and deeply distrustful. And on the outside, I am raging. It ends up later with me sleeping on the couch, sullen, wrapped up, still in silent rage. I don't want to be anywhere near her. She brings me Aloysius, tells me, your dinosaur wants to cuddle with you. I come flying up off the couch. This is emotional manipulation. She wants to emasculate me with this weak, pathetic image of myself, and I'll be damned if she succeeds. Rage is good. Rage is strong. Rage is utterly clear and supremely confident, and I will show her. I snatch Aloysius from her hand and grab my combat folder knife from the desktop, the same one that I carried in Iraq. March into the bedroom, put him down on the mattress, his stubby legs splayed, and that tentative smile of his shining up at me. Flick open the knife and raise my arm up, and a voice comes out of my mouth, quiet and plaintive. I'm sorry, buddy. It's only later that I realize it is my own voice. And then I stab him right in the gut, all the way through and into the mattress, and again. I rip the knife up his gut and neck, and his head lolls back, almost decapitated. I fling him away from me, sliding off of the knife, and he flies back behind the edge of the bed with one last sad, betrayed glimpse from a single brown eye. I turn to her, closing the knife. I hiss at her, finger jabbing at her face. You killed Aloysius! And then I push past her, slamming the door closed behind me. Go back to the couch, pull a blanket over my head, and lay there in the dark, hating, just hating, projecting it outwards and inwards into the black, till everything creeps into darkness in that strange way that oblivion sometimes has, where there is no boundary between being awake and being asleep. Morning, just a few hours later, gray, cold. I swam back into the world with that waking dream sense where just for a moment, everything is both clear and subtly luminous. That moment where I don't know where I am or really who I am. That long sense of the void coming back online, and then I remembered the night before. 25 years in the military, and the only person I know I killed was my inner child in the form of a stuffed dinosaur. Oh, and I ruined Valentine's Day, and I'm a shitty human being who's well on his way to destroying his second marriage. What can I possibly do to say or salvage this? No wonder everyone hates me. They're absolutely justified in feeling that way. Hell, I hate myself. Can I at least apologize? I mean, could it help even that just a little bit? I got to my feet, and worst of all, there is that feeling of having killed something small inside, the bit of me that was just starting to learn how to be gentle and kind again. Open the bedroom door. Liz is sitting there on the bed, eyes red, puffy from lack of sleep. She has a needle and thread, and she is sewing the last suture shut. She had retrieved Aloysius from the abyss behind the bed and had carefully restuffed him and put him back together again. Painstakingly sewed the wounds closed. She looked at me and then held him out to me. Your dinosaur still wants to cuddle with you. He's with me, even now as I write this. He's still the lovable dinosaur he always was, but there is something different about him now. He is scarred, emotionally as well as physically. On one side of his face, there's still just a suggestion of a timid smile, of the need to be reassured and protected. On the other side, there is something else, something about the sutured nature of his mouth, and the 1,000-yard stare in his deep glass eye. Something about betrayal and pain, and yet still yearning to love the Father God that did it to him, of transcending horror by continuing to be gentle and kind despite it. He is still my inner child, more than ever, and his reproach stabs me every time I look at him, and the lesson is not lost.
Thank you very much for that, Owen. All right. Our feast continues for you. There's still lots more, so stay with us. Next up is Professor Jesse Prinz.
Very, very hard acts to follow, so if anyone wants to walk out for a smoke or a shot of something. All right, so I do want to thank Krista. Having been very peripherally involved in this project, it has been one of the most, I think, inspiring and expansive intellectual exercises I've been witness to, bringing together people who are not part of the same conversations typically. Is very hard to achieve. I spend a lot of my time trying to do that, and my efforts just feeble so terribly in comparison to what Krista has pulled off in bringing this group of conversation partners together. So I'm here to listen more than anything, but I will try to earn my dinner by speaking. But I'm grateful for all of you and all of your voices, and for Krista bringing us together. Philosophy, which is my field, has many areas of focus, but two of the most central questions in philosophy have to do with personal identity, the question of who am I, what makes me the person that I am, and ethics, how should I act, what counts as good behavior, what counts as bad behavior. It turns out, for reasons that are historical, accidental, and I think unforgivable, philosophy has kept these two questions apart. People who talk about one tend not to talk about the other. And I think this is just a terrible oversight, because I think in the real world, when we think about our relationship to values, they're very, very closely connected to our identity. And that this project is really about bringing those together. So the underlying hypothesis here is that moral values are an important component of how we construct personal identities. The word construct there is important. There's no fundamental metaphysical truth about what makes me me, and different people construct themselves differently. Maybe your hobbies, your passions, your relationships, all kinds of commitments we have, your professional life, your recreational life, all of those things may be core to who you are, and all of them are deeply important, and individuals vary in what they bring into that collection, that constellation of things we call the self. But I think morality is an important part of that for most of us, and maybe even the most important part, as I'll try to bring out. I'm going to say a few words first about morality and how philosophers think about morality. This is a massive topic, so what I'm going to give you here is a very abbreviated, and really that's an understatement. I'm going to give you a snapshot, even a cartoon version of a certain kind of view associated with this gentleman, who's a Scottish philosopher named David Hume. And to put it in a nutshell, Hume thinks that when we make a moral judgment, a judgment that something is good or bad, right or wrong, immoral or immoral, we're really listening to our heart. Science describes how the world is. It tells us what facts exist, how things are arranged, the age of the universe, but it can't tell us right from wrong. It can't even tell us the beautiful and the ugly. It tells us what is, but not how things should be, how to make things better. So if we ask what brings value into the world, what makes things good and bad, that, Hume says, is a kind of projection of the heart. It's the world we want to live in, not the world we have. And those desires, those wants, those preferences come from within. So Hume focuses on judgment, making a statement like this is bad, this is good. That's what he's trying to analyze, and that's what a lot of philosophers analyze. Now, this question, what are we doing when we make moral judgments, has recently come to the attention of people working in another field, which is social psychology. And as I mentioned, I like to bring fields together, and for me, philosophy is sort of my, it's the job that pays my rent, but my part-time secret, if I could have two lives job, is as a social psychologist. So I also do a lot of experiments in that research tradition, and that's mostly what I'm going to be focusing on methodologically. So with various collaborators, we've done lots of studies trying to show that Hume was basically right. And one way to do this with psychology is to show that if you move people's emotions around, you can change their moral judgments. So with Kendall Eskin and Natalie Kastnick, both then at Brooklyn College, we conducted a study that was part of Kendall's thesis project where he gave people a very disgusting beverage, which is called Swedish bitters. So for any of you who are Swedish, my condolences. This is really an unpleasant thing to drink if you're not used to it. It's very, very bitter. And we gave this to people to drink, as well as some comparison things like water and Gatorade. And we asked people to make various judgments about the moral domain. How bad would it be if you found a wallet on the street, took the money from the wallet, and then returned the credit card? So you give yourself a little bonus for finding the wallet. How bad is it? It's not terrible, right? It's somewhere on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe it's a 6. But if you give people these Swedish bitters, it jumps up. You get to like an 8, which is pretty crazy. If you think about a 1 to 10 scale, why would like taking it just a fairly small transgression looks pretty bad after you drink this nasty beverage? Yes, sir.
You're saying that after they drank this,
Yep.
it affected their judgment.
Exactly.
It actually amplified what was there compared to what it was before they drank this?
You got it. Bingo. And that's
Does he chocolate and
I love, you know, probably. The thing is, like, how many people are comfortable right now? How many people have an ache in their foot or feel like it's too cold in here or too hot? There's so many things that are affecting us all the time. Emotions aren't things that we keep, like, level. It's not this steady Eddie thing. We're constantly being pushed around by our environment. Did you have a good day? Did you get enough sleep? What did you have for lunch? All of that stuff is affecting how we evaluate the world. So you can show this experimentally, but we're living that experiment every minute, every day of our lives. So, I mean, sometimes, Brett mentioned watching the news, and sometimes you see something on news and you start raging at the TV and throwing things. Sometimes you hear about something even worse and you sit there, that's terrible. You say it kind of in this blasé way, like, you know, it's like, you know, learning that it's going to be a little bit rainy tomorrow. I think that ability to show this very wide variation in our degree of intensity of moral engagement is a further sign that emotions are kind of in the driver's seat here. We've done this a lot of ways, and a lot of other psychologists have done it. One of the fun things we did, this was with Angelica Seidel, we played something called Japanese noise music. So has anyone in the room except Owen heard of Japanese voice? No, okay, so I should have brought some to play. I was worried about like disturbing the peace, but afterwards we can have a little Japanese noise music party upstairs. It's basically noise. It's music, they say, but it's something that the fans listen to because they want an intense experience. It's basically cacophony. And we put that on headphones, and people listen to that, and then they think about morality, and it makes them angry. So anger is this, music is something that plays out in the body all kinds of ways, and we feel it as emotion. So if you listen to loud, fast music, that's basically like taking your heart and making it beat faster, and you read that as anger, you read that as aggression, you read that as energy. So we can manipulate feelings with music, and with it, values change. So suddenly, you describe these events, somebody cuts you off on the road, how bad would that be? And people listening to this noise say, that would be terrible. I mean, if somebody cut me off on the road, that's really unforgivable behavior. No respecting fellow citizen should treat somebody in that kind of selfish, undignified way. So people are getting very upset about small transgressions. If you play cheerful music, so also with Angelica Seidel, we played this very kind of almost sickeningly sweet, uplifting classical music. For aficionados in the room, it was something called Morning Mood from the Peer Gynt's suite of Grieg. And I listen to this music, so there are individual differences. I want to kill when I hear this music. It doesn't do it for me. But for a lot of people, it puts them in, it's so cheerful. And we say things like, do you think it's good to give to charity? How much would you give? If you saw someone on the street who needed help, would you stop to help them out? Now, there's a lot of science that people don't typically do this, but you can ask for money, say you're homeless and asking for some help, in front of a cookie store where people are smelling the fragrance of these fresh-baked cookies. You're going to do a lot better. I don't know why people panhandle on the subway, because everyone's angry on the subway. They're commuting, it's crowded, it's unpleasant, it's claustrophobic. Do it up in the sun in front of a cookie store, and you'll come out ahead, because all these things are changing moods. So we're looking, when we do this, we measure judgment, and we see people feel like they have a moral obligation to help when they're in a good mood. So lots of research like that. So that's about how we make judgments. What are values? Values are just, so judgment is something you're making here and now. I might ask you, what do you think about this recent policy change? You can form a judgment about that. But what are your standing values? What are the things that you value in general? And you can all ask yourselves, what are the things you really care about? And I think if the emotion story is right, values are these dispositions to have emotions. To say you value something is to say, if this came to fruition, I would be really happy about it. To say you disvalue something is to say, if this came to fruition, I would be very upset about it, be angry about it. If I found myself doing this, because none of us are saints, and we all do things that go against our own values, how would you feel? And you say, I'd feel guilty, I'd feel ashamed of myself. If I did that, I would feel really badly. So values are these ways that make us have a certain emotional response to things that occur to us in the world. There's a concept that goes further than that, which is the notion of identification. This is a philosopher named Harry Frankfurt. And he has this idea that in addition to our values, there are things we value valuing. A lot of us have values that we just got by osmosis. Like maybe you grew up in a community that has certain biases that have made you have these knee-jerk reactions to all kinds of things and people that don't really reflect the kind of person you want to be. So of all of our emotional responses, there are some that we really want to have and some that we don't want to have. If you find yourself getting annoyed after listening to Japanese noise music and thinking the whole world is terrible, you might step back and say, those aren't really my values. Those aren't the things I care about. That's just been planted in me by this music. So we can identify with some values, we don't identify with others. But the values that we identify with can be described as the values we value valuing, which sounds like a Gertrude Stein poem, but the basic idea is you feel good about having these values. You feel guilty. You'd feel guilty if you didn't have these values. You feel angry at people who lack the values that you care about. Okay, now identity. So that's what morals are. Morals are these emotion-based judgments that we have as dispositions. Those are values, and then we identify with some of those. So the word identity already snuck in there. So we can now just define a term, which is the moral self, which is just the set of values with which I identify. So your moral, all of us have one, and there might be some psychopaths in the room, but for those of us who have moral values, and I think actually psychopaths do too, and there's been a kind of medicalization of that construct that we get kind of fed through all this kind of reality, these cop shows and horror films, but I think there's a much richer and varied psychology there as well. But you have the values you identify with. That's your moral self. We all have one. Now, we got interested in studying whether this notion of a moral self, we just stipulated that definition, is it really a notion of the self? Is it really something that's important to people's sense of who they are? Can anyone here identify the person? Okay, so oh, it says it, there we go. Cheater. All right. Somebody smart in the room can read. So Patty Hearst is, you'll all know, was the daughter of a publishing magnate who was raised in a wealthy conservative family, who was then, according to the standard narrative, brainwashed by a radical group, and she became a kind of bank robber / terrorist. And people describe this as she's a whole new person. And the whole concept of brainwashing, which, I mean, it's a very weird metaphor if you think about it. But the metaphor is kind of, what are you washing away when you brainwash someone? It could be a lot of things. It could be memories. But I think when we think about that term, what's really getting washed away is values. You're rewriting somebody's moral script. That's what brainwashing is about. And I think it can be thought of as a kind of moral death for the people who, William Randolph Hearst, for him, his daughter was gone. She was lost. Maybe resurrection is possible. Maybe she could be brought back through some moral retraining. But for that moment, when she was under the influence of this group, she was gone to him. And that notion of change that can end a person as you were before and turn into a new person is what we started to investigate. So we did a bunch of studies looking at this. The first published one was by my collaborators, Nina Strominger and Sean Nichols. And they were just interested in how morality relates to identity in comparison to some other things. And again, remember, identity is something we construct. So they're not measuring scientific facts in the way they're trying to find some objective truth. They're trying to find out what people care about. When they come to personal identity, what kinds of things matter to us most? So they asked people to imagine hypothetical scenarios. Scenarios we've all faced. So you have a loved one who's aging and their faculties are being affected by the ravages of age. Maybe they can no longer perceive things. Maybe their desires are affected, like their personal tastes. Maybe they've lost all of their memories of their past. Are they the same person? And on a scale that goes to 100, the percent of perceived loss of these things is considerable. It's near 40%. So you can think about this like 60% of your relative who's lost her memories is there, But at 40%, nearly half is gone. That person has sustained a major loss of self. But here's morality. So morality of all of these things really is the outlier. And they did this again and again, and we did it again and again, and we've done, I don't know, something in the neighborhood of 80, 90 studies, a variance of this thing, asking people what they care about with identity. And no matter how we ask morality, it comes out more important. The first study that was done with this, that Sean Nichols and I did, it was published after that one I just mentioned, a simple, hypothetical, very philosophical scenario, just a hypothetical case. Somebody's walking through the mountains, they fall, they hit their head, and they lose their memory in one version. Some of our participants heard they lost their memory, they have no memory of the past, but their values remain the same. Or the reverse of that, they lost their values, but they have all their memories. Your whole biography is intact, but your values have changed. And the question is, are they the same person? And this we did a 7-point scale, where not the same person is the bottom of the scale. And you can see that loss of moral values makes people think you're no longer the same person to a much greater degree than loss of memory. So lots of results like this. If you do it with religion and politics as a proxy for morality, loss of religion, change in your religion. People have religious transformations. Change in your political values, going from being a liberal to a conservative, like with the neocons who began as very left-wing liberals and became ultra-conservative. That's a real kind of transformation of self. So we said, are you the same person? Are you a different person? And we had a whole bunch of comparison cases, change in where you live, change in how you work. This work was done with Javier Gomez-Levine, a student who I work with at the Grad Center. And again, the moral dimensions, religion and politics, changed identity. Non-moral things like occupation and neighborhood did not. So we started looking at this in more applied context, because we weren't just interested in these very hypothetical philosophical cases, but in real transformations in human life. And one thing we started looking at is attitudes towards prison parole, and we're starting to do some archival work. This is again with Javier Gomez-Levine, and we simply wanted to know if somebody in prison, because the unpleasant conditions of prison life leads them to stop behaving badly, says to a parole board, you know what, I will never reoffend. I hate prison. I'm never coming back here. I've learned my lesson. I'm not going to do this. Would you give them parole? And that is something real parole boards face. But imagine another kind of inmate who maybe has found God in prison or really just seems to be a different person and says, you know what, that 20-year-old who committed those crimes, I don't know who that is. I don't identify with that person. I don't feel any desire to engage in this behavior. I just can't even put my head in that place. You might be equally confident, and we ask people this, you're equally confident that both these people won't reoffend. But the one who won't reoffend because they are afraid of going back to prison, and the one who won't reoffend because they've morally changed, they're given different parole outcomes. And they're also given different parole outcomes for a reason. People who respond to our survey say they really are a different person. In one survey I won't show you, we asked, are you speaking metaphorically or literally? People said, no, literally. That's just you're a different person if your values change that way. I'm not going to try to explain the data slide, but that's basically what I just described. We've been looking at this with immigration. Somebody moves to the country. Right now, immigration is a big issue. We did this, Gomez-Levine and also a collaborator named Jörg Fingerhut in Germany. So we're looking at this also in the European context. It's facing a lot of immigration issues. And people have a lot of anxiety about immigrants coming into the country. But imagine two kinds of immigrants. One who comes and assimilates in terms of their behavior. So they, start eating local cuisine, dressing in the local way, doing things that locals do. And another who assimilates in terms of value. And what we find is that if your values change, that's seen as a transformation of identity. And that's seen as somehow less of a threat, more of a positive thing. So values are very important to your social partners, who you're going to interact with, who you consider one of your in-group. And that's something we've been looking at too, the group dynamics of identity. We think of identity very individualistically, like it's something that I have, myself, just mine. But if morality is part of identity, identity is about groups. It's about what group do I belong to. We sometimes use the word tribe here, the moral tribe that you belong to. So how many of you who use social networks have friends who show like a big diversity of political views? Or how many of you say, well, most of your friends vote the same way as you do? And most of us are like that. And you can do, Linda Skitka did these studies where she simply brought two chairs into her psychology lab and she said, pull that chair over and another student's going to sit there to join you. She's just stepped out to the restroom. And sitting on the bag, there's a backpack with a button that says pro-life or pro-choice. And then the student pulls the chair over, and all Linda Skitka does is she measures the distance between the two chairs. And then she says, by the way, where do you stand on abortion? And basically people create physical distances between themselves and anyone who's morally different. We want to only have friends. Like, how many of you would date somebody who voted for the person you opposed in the last election cycle? That's like a deal breaker for a lot of people. So that's what we're talking about. Now, I'm going to end by applying this to moral injury. And Brett Litz has done a great job of introducing us to that concept. Basically, what occurred to me is that the transformations that are experienced by combat veterans and others who have contact with war are identity transformations. And this already comes out in some of the survey instruments that are used to look at moral injury. But we wanted to really try and see whether ordinary people see the effects of combat as affecting identity. And this is very, very preliminary work. This is just done. In fact, there were a bunch of stats that I wanted to do on this for you that I couldn't do because my online access to the statistics program had been lost. But I'm not going to, this is a lot of text, so I'm just going to summarize for you. So the first round, I wanted to know, are you the same, what do people think about somebody who has participated in an episode of violence and war that has been characterized by media as an atrocity, and a person who then experiences symptoms of post-traumatic stress? And what I found is overwhelmingly people said, you're no longer the same person. But this is about to get more interesting. So this is already kind of proof of point that undergoing an experience of that kind has got to just change who you are. But I wanted, as you do in a psych experiment, compare it to different, you always have a comparison scenario, your control condition. So what if you just witness an episode, you don't participate in it? Same response. So from a psych perspective, this is useless because you need to show a statistical difference between two conditions. They came out the same. So I thought, okay, well, there's something wrong with this. And then, of course, reading people like Brett, I was like, oh, what an idiot. I just messed up because, of course, being witness to this stuff is already recognized for anyone who's worked with veterans and service people. That's going to have similar kinds of effects potentially. So the witnessing, participating distinction doesn't really cut any ice. It's fascinating and important, really important, that merely being witness can have this kind of effect. So that was confirmed here. I also worried about the fact that I was explicitly mentioning PTSD because some of this work tries to tease apart moral injury from PTSD. But the other thing is there's a lot of work suggesting moral injury is connected to certain emotions like guilt and shame. So I thought, let me measure those. So I did it again. I got rid of the PTSD. I still did the participate witness thing, but now I added a bunch of questions about emotions. So here's somebody who participates in an event. Don't read the vignette because there's actually an error in this vignette, but someone who participates in an event this is another event that's considered an atrocity. And are they the same person? People say no, near the bottom of the scale again. Same numbers, by the way. Every one of these studies that came out, 2.2, 2.4, basically in that range. And that's not a statistically significant difference. We looked at emotions, 7-point scale, and just all these negative emotions were way up toward the top of the scale. Huge ratings for guilt and sadness and shame. So this was to be expected, anger too, which is important. Then we looked at the witnessing case, and I thought, okay, here witnessing, we've gotten rid of the PTSD, maybe witnessing will look different. No, still a loss of self. If you merely witness a terrible act in which civilians are killed, but fascinatingly, the emotions are there too. So people recognize that even if you just witness a horror in the context of combat, guilt and shame are going to be part of that equation. And by the way, an enormous number of the majority of my participants, it was a random sample using Mechanical Turk, which is an online survey system, but I had a description of the survey. A majority of my participants either have served or have a close family member who served. And I think they were just attracted to this survey. So this is the stats I wanted to do, whether those people answer these questions differently. But I think most of us have contact with someone in our families or a friend, if we haven't ourselves served. And so this is really coming from experience. It's not just a fantasy. People know that these events are going to affect people in very deep ways, both in terms of their identity and their emotions. So here was another one. So I said, okay, well, this is killing civilians. What if you kill enemy combatants? So here's a case. Oh, this is a case where combatants on both sides are killed. So what happens here? The same. So for psychologists in the room, this is a very boring result because every study came out exactly the same. And I'll give you one more, which is sort of the most surprising. So here, it's just enemy combatants who are killed. That's your job. That's what you're supposed to do. And I say explicitly that the person who's been in this experience agrees with this, fully consistent with Frank's moral code, killing enemy combatants. Is Frank the same person? I suggest that there are some symptoms of trauma here, difficult to reintegrate in society, but that Frank endorses the behavior explicitly. No, not the same person. And look at this. I mean, this is a case where you're doing your job, and that shame is there. So I think for those of us who are at a remove from what soldiers do for us every day, we have to recognize that even those cases that we would embrace as sort of the moral mandate, what they're supposed to be doing, what we've asked them to do as a nation, those things are harmful as well and have an emotional toll, potentially. Not for everyone, but for people, the idea that people can experience trauma, and when they do, even in the course of their duty and fulfilling their duty in a way that they consider honorable and right, there can still be guilt and shame and anger. So traumatic war experiences, first of all, I think need to be thought of as affecting identity. And I think that's something everyone in this room came here because we recognize. This is connected with emotions like guilt and shame. I think anger too. So I need to do the stats to show how all these emotions relate to this effect. But the role of emotions in this cannot be denied. This is really what it's fundamentally about. And importantly, we need to recognize that people who are doing their duty are experiencing potentially this kind of threat to identity and pain as well. So I think that morality has to be part of how we think about trauma. The presence, the universal recognition that emotions like guilt and shame are part of trauma in this context is so important and we can't ignore it anymore. And I think it's also equally important that we recognize that what's at stake here is not just comfort, not just well-being, not just really important things like being able to reintegrate with civilian society and continue your civilian life after service, but who you are. Those are the stakes. Identity. Are you going to be the same person after service as you were before? And if we don't recognize that that's what somebody is potentially giving up for us, in addition to putting their life on the line, they're putting themselves on the line. And that's a very deep debt that we owe to people who make these decisions. I'm going to close, but I just want to, because Nietzsche has been on our program and I'm a philosopher by training, I just want to mention that Nietzsche might have some resources for thinking about this. And forgive the weird buzzing sound. I don't know if these are authentic films. My brother sent them to me the other day, but there are these, someone has claimed that they had footage of Nietzsche sort of on his deathbed. So Nietzsche says some things that are very disturbing. He says that that guilt is this terrible thing, that we shouldn't feel guilty, that we shouldn't have conscience, that conscience is an invention, that we all have this urge to be wild and free, and that society gives us conscience, but it's a kind of constraint. It's very dissonant and jarring to read Nietzsche. But I think there's a lot of wisdom there. One piece of wisdom is he does recognize, at least implicitly, that identity is something we construct socially, and that our values are part of that identity, and that our social affiliations are part of that identity. But I also think his most important points about guilt are not this denigration of guilt, and he's not giving us an injunction to all be psychopaths and to not care about what we do and to not have any heart or any concern for causing harms to others. In the book, he embraces cruelty and says all kinds of things that are really, really disturbing. But I think his point is subtler than that. And I think his point is in part connected to his critique of free will. And he says what we do, what we choose to do, is not a function of some independent soul that can kind of make free, perfect, rational decisions as if it's an isolated entity untouched by anything else. Everything we do is being affected by everything around us. The combat situation, the orders we've been given, the way we've been raised, the heat, the temperature, being under fire, all of these things are affecting our behavior. So when you come home and you find yourself tortured by things you've done, things you've seen, it really is important to listen to Nietzsche's point, which is that this is not something you created. And it goes all the way up, too. When we think about our trusting our politicians to put lives and identities on the line for the sake of our nation, we need to know that that means that people who have made this agreement to serve are under a commitment of duty to carry out whatever orders they get from on high. So this idea that we internalize and we bear, those who serve end up bearing the brunt of that experience when the people who have sent them there are so far removed from it, that's something that we need to think about. So when you're thinking about that pain of I've been there, I've done this, that diffusion of guilt and realizing that there is this larger picture, that agency is something that's distributed and responsibility is something shared and something structural and something that extends upward and outward, that's so fundamentally important. I'm going to end. I'm going to say thank you. I know there are people here who have been in the armed services, who are in the armed services, who are connected or have loved ones. I just want to say a special word of gratitude to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jesse. And we are going to have a little bit of time for questions, but we're going to have Mariette Kalinowski take us out. Before we do that, reading from her short story, The Train.
First of all, I want to say thank you to Krista and especially to Gina. Can we give them a round of applause, please? This has been a wonderful and fulfilling year working on this project, and I feel privileged to be considered a part of it. I am going to start with The Train very briefly, and then I'm going to go into some new stuff, which is very, very raw, so please be very, very forgiving. During this entire process, I've always come back to this idea of a circularity of time, the fact that history is always repeating itself. We've studied ancient literature, which first approached this during Homerian times, but we are now talking about modern literature and modern modalities in order to redefine this. And it makes me wonder if some hundreds or thousands of years in the future, will I and will we have had enough of an impact on this field to improve the lives of returning veterans in their era. And in the least, I hope we improve their lives, and in the most idealistic world, we will engender a final and lasting peace that does not require this. So The Train is about an unnamed female veteran who has experienced the death of a close comrade. On the final night of her bed rest, she couldn't sleep. Sometime in the very early morning, she shuffled slowly out to the burn barrel on the outskirts of the compound, carrying her bloodied camis, clutching them to her chest like she had the Iraqi girl. When the flames burned hot and tall, she threw in her uniform and boots. She crept as close to the flames as possible, feeling the sharp heat on her face, neck, and chest. She wanted to get even closer, to climb into the flames and curl up at the corners into ash the way her camis did. Feel the flames eat into her skin in widening holes until she was consumed like her boots, melt away into the embers of the fire, feel her bones flake and rise up on the heat of the flames into the empty black sky where their last sparks would drift away like spinning stars. Then, finally, with a concussive exhale, the train comes to the end of the line. She rises calmly and crosses the gap with ease, walks beneath the sign, Times Square, 42nd Street. Feels her feet move easily across the platform and her body move in and out and around the people on the platform. The dead bird, her mother's words, coming forward in her thoughts and mixing with the people, with her movement. She should have died with Kavanaugh. She shouldn't be walking across the platform trying to reach the escalator. She shouldn't be in the city at all. She had tried to forget everything, had tried to sink into drunkenness, into meds, tried to stay awake in fear of the dreams, burrow into some dark place that would give her a break from the memories, from the ECP that would come when she inevitably fell asleep. The pain of self-abuse still felt better than the guilt. Guilt drove it all. Anger that things had gone so wrong. I don't know how to let you go, she thinks her mother wanted to say. She understands her mother, understands the need to hold on to whatever you can of a person who leaves, who is gone, the fear of the gaping hole that person creates, and in the way the pain seems to fill it. She carries Kavanaugh with her, always the still and bloody Kavanaugh that didn't fly home. Rarely the quiet sketch of her in California. And she tries to change the ending, tries to make it so that Kavanaugh walked away from the ECP and Warren never moved in, tries to make it so she shouted sooner or squeezed the trigger until she felt her weapon buck into her shoulder, pink mist clouding from the dead Haji. But even if she changes things in her mind, they were still the same in reality. So she rides the train. She steps onto the escalator, her shoulders rocked back with the first motion upwards. She'll get out of the subway, she thinks, find a bench or someplace to sit, and call her mom to tell her to not expect her. She's not sure exactly what she'll say to her mom, or whether she'll make any sense when she tries to describe this need, this understanding inside her that she shouldn't go to Vermont. Not right now. But she knows that if she takes her time now, that there will be more time in the future. No more calling at the last minute to cancel coffee or dinner plans. She could see her in a little while, sometime soon maybe, just 1 or 2 weeks before she goes up to the summer house. She imagines sitting next to her mom and rocking back and forth in the old wicker chairs and watching the thunderheads building and the energy rippling through the air. She smells ozone. A beer sweats in her hand. She watches the opaque gray clouds darken the summer sky prematurely into a false twilight, the overcast sky looking so much like the one over the ECP. Her mother looks at the distant green mountains and is just rocking. Then the wind picks up and blows through the screened porch, and she feels herself lifting, rising, buoyant on the heat rising into the air and swirling into the clouds. Okay. I would call this kind of a reflection on the past year and my thought about repair and reintegration. The average person considers their life narrative in a standard beginning, middle, and end, expecting a logical conclusion to their existence. Over the course of a lifetime, a person expects to move forward chronologically, with memories and the occasional story shared with friends and family, the only backward or circular movement, a natural deviation from the expected path forward. But those who experience trauma, whether combat or authorized, because I in no way claim post-traumatic stress, those who have lived through an event that marks them seem to be forever circling back onto this one moment, re-experiencing the trauma over and over. This single point in their life that has such power that there no longer seems to be a movement forward or even backward, but around and around, caught in the gravity of that event and orbiting. A planet-sized moment in a smaller satellite of a person, forever locked. Freud, not long after World War I, saw veterans returning home and described what came to be known as a death drive, a natural yearning of living creatures towards death, and suggested that a person who survives trauma or death fixates on that event. The psyche believes that this was the proper end to that person. The result is a circular, unending re-experiencing of death, which disrupts normal life narrative. To a combat veteran, this seems obvious. It's no leap to think of surviving an IED blast, an ambush, or the enemy rocket that just missed your hooch as a mistaken death, a simulation that tricks the brain with adrenaline, traumatic wounds, and a blackout that is logged as true death. That final goal of every creature, the final period of the final sentence in the narrative of a living person, not necessarily desired, but still achieved by all. But then to wake up, to be stabilized, to find that you will live beyond that death, that there is more to be written in your story, a kind of triumph over the grave, a sense of relief that you will return home. The heart rejoices, but the psyche laments. The unconscious mind does not understand why the body continues if it has already suffered death. There's confusion that the blast was not fatal. The mind returns to the event in order to make sense of survival. What went wrong? What should have happened? Is there a way to correct it? And so the reliving of this moment, the circular existence, becomes a kind of research, an attempt at revision to rewrite what really happened. An endless review of the same brief sequence, a section of film rewound again and again, the details becoming rote, memorable only in the instant of their occurrence, the characters appearing and disappearing in their roles across the frame. The imagined outcome that should have happened, the meditation on true death, or the wished-for survival of a more deserving buddy. In my own case, I define my life as before the Marine Corps and after. I further break that down into before Iraq and after. I find that this is partly because I'm still working to reconcile those before, during, and after lives. I'm still searching for a language adequate to describe my experiences. I'm still fighting personal demons so that I can speak without fear and without doubt. But I've also found my personal narrative has been disrupted. My time after Iraq, after the Marine Corps, my return to school and life has been complicated by an ongoing struggle with mistranslation of experience, of a miscommunication of my emotions. I believe this can be described by that idea outside the wire. Extend the wire beyond fobs, but to the entire globe and everyone who is encompassed in it. Beyond Iraq, Afghanistan, Eastern Africa. Outside the wire versus inside the wire. Vulnerable and exposed versus somewhat safe, sort of comfortable. Alert and vigilant versus relaxed enough to feel the knots, the tension in the neck and the shoulders, but not relaxed enough to sleep through the night. Open sky and desert with nothing between you and them, or still beneath open sky and desert with only cyclone fencing, razor wire, concrete barriers, and HESCOs to keep them from getting in. Except, of course, those who are hired to serve you chow or do your laundry. Sealed into an up-armored Humvee or an air-conditioned, internet-wired two-man can, or a pressurized 727 somewhere over Europe, the Atlantic, the Midwest, before landing in San Diego and seeing the same open sky, but no desert, because you're home. But you still look for the fencing, razor wires, entry control points, or guns to put between you and them. They are everyone who doesn't know who you are or what you've seen. They are all around you without those barriers, without rules of engagement or escalations of force, and still no common language. The wire is so far behind you, there is no returning to that sort of safety, the kind of comfort that comes with rules and missions. Home is now forever outside the wire. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariette, and to all of our speakers and presenters tonight. You gave us so much to think about, such a rich menu, really, of ideas for us to consider, and you were a terrific and patient audience as well. I'm going to suggest that we get 2 questions that get us started with discussion down here, and then we're quickly going to take ourselves upstairs so that more people can be engaged and talk about things. All right, so I will take responsibility for having planned too much and being greedy to cram it all in. But speakers, do you want to just sort of maybe turn and so 2 questions to get us started, and then we'll continue the discussion upstairs? Yes, all the way in the back.
Army veteran, and I'm a CUNY film student. Just was very curious when I saw this discussion put together. I was quite excited because it's a topic that's, of course, near and dear. You know, a lot of my friends who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in particular, the ones who were National Guard or reservists. And I always wondered, you know, coming back, like, I know when you're full-time active duty, you go back to your unit, you serve, and you deal with people who, they don't go home, whereas these guys come back to a life that is supposed to be a civilian life transition. So I was just curious on your point of view as far as the therapy and what the process that could be in place that changes how these guys cope, because I see 2 different stories. I have one friend who his experience, he of course went through combat and went through a lot of horror, and he was able to regain some normalcy in his life. And on the other hand, I have a friend who lost 9 of his buddies in a convoy, and he found the attack on the internet a year later from the Taliban's perspective. So needless to say, his recovery wasn't as, I guess, I can't use the word smooth, but his recovery wasn't as clear and defined. And I was just curious on your point of view from that.
Thank you very much. Is part of your question about, is there a difference in presentation and experience between reservists and non-reservists? Maybe if we can just focus the answer on that part, we'll continue the discussion upstairs. Dr. Litz, do you see any difference between reservists and non-reservists?
Yeah. Well, there's evidence that reservists and guardsmen struggle with different issues, and their identity is different, and so there's sort of an added burden of maybe not being keeping yourself in the culture, as you're referring to, is you sort of go back to your community, and perhaps rather abruptly, and then leaving and being obligated to leave that community and your family, and not being part of the active duty world is part of that struggle as well. So I think there's a lot to share about what might be unique, but that's certainly a clear difference. That there are sort of unique issues and unique struggles on top of the same trauma that anyone may experience. So does that kind of get at what you're asking?
Do you think there's a need to have a different way of helping these veterans?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I have colleagues that they're devoting their careers to helping the Guard and reservists and appreciating their unique culture and their unique needs. So this is being attended to. It's something that the VA does a pretty good job of, I would say, to be honest. But
And Mariette wants to weigh in, and then we'll take a question over here. Mariette.
Sure. So I enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserves, and I spent almost 4 years on active duty, based on activations for deployment. And I have to say that the first discrepancy is when you return home, the reservists are literally shunted off and checked out and returned home within 48 hours. The first time I returned home from Iraq to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, my parents thought I had been lost somewhere in transit because they had gone to the regular Marine Corps welcome home, and they then had to search around the base to find me because I was going through my checkout procedure. So I think it might not necessarily be therapy modalities or how the VA can fix themselves, but how the regular military can change their way of treating veterans, or reservists, when they're being augmented and then checked out.
And so we'll go here, and then we'll all continue discussion upstairs.
I think we do a disservice to veterans when we conflate the notion of patriotic duty and military service. As a Marine foot soldier, I never met anyone who was there out of a sense of patriotic duty. All of us wanted to accomplish something for ourselves. I wanted to be a hero. I thought it would make me a stronger person. I knew plenty of people who wanted to get out of the house, out of the neighborhood, off the block, off the farm, into a job, and maybe get some benefits, hopefully come home in one piece. And I think if we can see veterans as they are, as their real motivations are, we can do a better job of serving them. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything any of our panelists want to say? Yeah, sure. Take us out, Ron.
By the way, all the speakers were great. To you, sir. What's your name again? I'm sorry. Yes, sir. Jesse. What you said was really fantastic because when you talked about the heat and the taste of the dust, and then it brought me back to the bitter, it is true, the environment can amplify fear. It does amplify emotion, the environment, because a lot of the young, as the staff sergeant over there would tell you, the environment in Iraq is not conducive to higher thinking. You don't want to practice philosophy. You're not thinking about Homer. Everything is very fearful. You're very frightened. And staff, I worked at ECP in Iraq, and I read The Train. It took me about 5 hours. Now, because it's long, but it evokes so much thought and emotion that I would read a paragraph at the most and have to put it down, and then I would have to ponder about it and then work through the emotions that it evoked. Very powerful. Thank you very much. And I can relate to you on many, many levels. But to the question, there is a question mark at the end of this. I show you is Professor Litz. You had a slide on there that was really fascinating. So in all of my time in the military, I think I had to go through suicide awareness quarterly, if not semi-annually, right? And they told us all the time, they told the soldiers all the time, once you lose hope, that's when you need to be fearful of that soldier. Once despair sets in. But you wrote up there that pain is hope. And I was kind of hoping if you could elaborate on that, because I found that fascinating.
Well, sorry.
An abundance of them.
So, we are treating, in this case, we're doing a psychotherapy trial, treating Marines at Camp Pendleton, and there are, in this case, Marines who feel like they don't deserve to get help, and they don't feel like they deserve to be changed and to not suffer. And if they cross the line to seek help, which is an enormous step to take, our stance is that, that their pain is a sign that they could have a hopeful future, because if their injuries are moral and the like, it means that at one time they had they had the right balance of good and bad. I think what you're talking about is despair and hopelessness. That's part of it too. But if someone seeks care and they have despair and hopefulness, the fact that they're seeking care, which is an enormous, threshold. As care providers, we have to assume that that means there is hope, and to have that vibe and to impart that in some way. Does that help?
It does to me seem a bit paradoxical, because they want the pain to end, but you're saying that the pain is good because it is hope. So to me, it just seems a bit. I don't want to sound more intelligent than I am.
No. Yeah.
But it seems a bit odd,
Well, there are those who feel such guilt that they feel they deserve to be in pain. And yes, and so if they're seeking help, our assumption is that that pain, first of all, we cannot give them the expectation that that is going to go away, and we're going to, as wizards, take it away completely. And we don't actually hear a lot of, I want this to go away completely. But we see it as the start of a process of healing and repairing. And it feels awful to go through that. And so that's where the pain comes from. But if you're going through that, by definition, that means there's some future that you're anticipating, right? Which is, if you're anticipating a future, you have some hope. Got it?
Great. And that's an excellent way for us to end. Thank you. Please join us upstairs. Resist the temptation to hover down here. Let's go upstairs and continue the discussion.